The tension was palpable, the moment charged with uncertainty. Malia Obama, the daughter of former President Barack Obama, was pulled over on a lonely stretch of highway in California. What started as a routine traffic stop quickly spiraled into an experience that no one could have predicted. The officers treated her with suspicion, disrespect, and humiliation, as if she were just another girl on the road. But the moment her father arrived, everything changed. What happened next? It stunned everyone who witnessed it, from bystanders to the officers themselves. But here's the question. Why did this happen in the first place? Why was a young woman, who had done nothing wrong, subjected to such an ordeal? This isn't just about one incident, one girl, or one encounter with law enforcement. It's about a much bigger issue that affects countless people every single day: racial profiling, systemic injustice, and the ways in which people are treated based on their skin color, their background, or the name they carry. In this video, we're diving into the story of Malia Obama's terrifying experience and looking at the larger, more complex issues at play. You might think it's a story reserved for high-profile figures, but the sad truth is, it's a story that could happen to anyone. Let's unpack what happened, what it means, and what we can learn from this moment together. Before we get started, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring important stories like this to light. The California sun hung low in the late afternoon sky, casting long golden rays over the endless stretch of asphalt ahead. Malia Obama, fresh off a powerful speech at a youth equality summit in San Francisco, was making her way down the quiet highway towards Los Angeles. The car hummed steadily beneath her, the only sounds the soft music playing in the background and the occasional hum of the tires on the road. The landscape around her was peaceful, rolling hills in the distance, dry brush lining the highway, and only the occasional cluster of scrubby trees breaking up the monotony. The silence was refreshing, offering her a brief moment of respite after a whirlwind of interviews, panels, and speeches. It had been a long few days. Malia had poured her heart into her presentation at the summit, hoping to inspire the next generation of young leaders to challenge the systems that had long held power. The applause and praise after her talk had been fulfilling, but the real reward had come from the young people who approached her afterward, sharing their own stories of perseverance in the face of adversity, their eyes alight with determination. It was clear they felt a deep connection with her, and she could sense the weight of their struggles in every word they spoke. For Malia, these moments were bittersweet. On one hand, she knew she had been able to make a difference, to spark something in others. On the other, being the daughter of a former president carried its own unique burdens. The weight of her last name was never far from her mind. Everywhere she went, people saw her through the lens of her father's legacy. While she worked tirelessly to define her own identity and make her own impact, she was often reduced to being just Obama's daughter. As the hours passed and the drive stretched on, Malia allowed herself a rare moment of relaxation. She glanced at the dashboard clock. It was just after 6:30 p.m., and she knew she still had a few hours ahead of her before reaching Los Angeles. Her playlist shifted to a mellow acoustic track, the soothing music helping her relax for the first time in weeks. There were no schedules to follow, no reporters to answer to, and no cameras to face. It was just her and the open road. And for a brief moment, it felt like she could breathe again. But even as she allowed herself to relax, the thought of her father lingered in the back of her mind. She had spent years trying to forge her own path, to break free of the expectations that came with being part of one of the most famous families in the world. Her father's advice often echoed in her thoughts: stay calm, stay focused, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. It was advice she had taken to heart, and it had served her well in many situations. But in that moment, as she drove through the quiet countryside, she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live a life where her every move wasn't scrutinized, where she wasn't constantly compared to the legacy of the man who had been president. As she lost herself in these thoughts, the quiet was abruptly shattered. A sudden flash of blue and red lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. Instinctively, Malia checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. and she knew she had followed every traffic law to the letter. So why were the officers pulling her over? Her pulse quickened as she slowly eased off the gas pedal and signaled to pull onto the dusty shoulder of the road. She could feel a knot forming in her stomach, a combination of confusion and unease. The road was desolate. There were no other cars around. No reason for her to be stopped. She parked the SUV and took a steadying breath, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she fumbled for her license and registration. This was routine, she reminded herself. She had been through traffic stops before, but as she gathered the documents, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The officers approached, their figures tall and imposing against the backdrop of the fading sunlight. Both were white, both wore dark sunglasses, and both carried the unmistakable air of authority. Malia's mind raced. She had been pulled over plenty of times before, usually in busy, populated areas, but this felt different. The officers didn't seem to be acting like it was just another routine stop. Their eyes, hidden behind their sunglasses, seemed to assess her, sizing her up in a way that made her uncomfortable. One of the officers, the taller of the two, spoke first. His voice was sharp, commanding as he asked her where she was headed. Malia kept her composure, replying politely, but there was a sense of tension creeping in. The officer exchanged a look with his partner, the shorter man with a buzz cut, who stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, and then, without any explanation, the taller officer told Malia to step out of the vehicle. Confusion clouded her thoughts as she processed the command. Step out of the vehicle? Why? She wasn't sure what to say, but she knew better than to argue. Her father's advice rang in her ears again. Stay calm, stay focused, and she pushed down the unease rising in her chest. Without a word, Malia opened the door and stepped out of the SUV. She could feel the eyes of the officers on her, their gaze unnervingly cold as they began rummaging through her car, pulling out her laptop, her books, her papers, anything they could get their hands on. She watched as one of the officers held up her laptop, mocking her. "Fancy stuff," he said. His tone dripped with condescension. Malia clenched her fists, fighting the urge to snap back. She was a student, she wanted to say, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she forced herself to remain calm, answering only the questions they asked her. But even as she stood there, trying to keep her composure, the feeling of being treated like a suspect began to gnaw at her. The humiliation, the disrespect. It was clear this wasn't a routine traffic stop. And that's when she felt the sharp sting of injustice, a feeling that would only intensify as the minutes stretched on. The officers didn't believe her. They didn't believe that she was just a young woman on a quiet drive to Los Angeles. They didn't see her as a person. They saw her as a threat, a target, someone to be interrogated and humiliated. The situation was escalating, and Malia knew she had to stay focused, stay calm, but inside, she could feel the rage building. Malia's mind raced as the officers continued to inspect her vehicle, throwing her personal belongings around as if they were nothing more than pieces of junk. She tried to keep her composure, forcing herself to breathe steadily, but every muscle in her body was tense. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It had transformed into something far darker, something far more personal. As she stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, one of the officers pulled out her phone and began scrolling through it. Malia could feel her heart rate pick up. Was this even legal? She wanted to shout at them to stop, to demand an explanation, but she knew better than to challenge them outright. That was what they wanted, a reaction. They wanted to see her get angry, to give them an excuse to escalate the situation further. Her thoughts flashed back to the countless stories she had heard growing up, stories of young black men and women being stopped, harassed, and even arrested for no reason at all. Her father, President Barack Obama, had spoken about racial injustice and police brutality many times during his time in office. She had witnessed firsthand the toll such experiences had taken on families across the country. But this was different. She wasn't just watching from the sidelines anymore. This wasn't a distant news story or a statistic. It was happening to her, in real time, on a quiet highway miles away from home. "Who are you?" "Really?" the officer with the buzz cut asked, his voice sharp and accusatory. Malia blinked, confused by the question. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing anxiety she felt inside. "Are you sure you're who you say you are?" The officer's words were laced with suspicion. His eyes narrowed as he glanced at the documents in his hand. "Malia Obama? That's your name." "Huh." Malia felt a knot form in her stomach. The mention of her last name, the one she had spent so many years trying to distance herself from, hung in the air like a weight. In that moment, she realized that they hadn't pulled her over for a routine traffic violation. They had pulled her over because of who she was, because of her family's name, because of the expectations and assumptions that came with being the daughter of the 44th President of the United States. For a brief second, everything seemed to freeze. Her surroundings, the officers, even the warm California air, all of it disappeared. And Malia was left standing alone in a moment that felt both surreal and suffocating. The reality of what was happening hit her like a punch to the gut. She had always known that her identity would be shaped by her father's legacy, but she had never imagined it would manifest like this, on the side of the road, with two strangers questioning her worth and right to exist. Her mind flickered to the stories she had read about young black men and women who had faced far worse in situations like this. Those who had been treated like criminals simply because of the color of their skin. The ones who had lost their lives in moments just like this one. The idea that it could happen to her, too, sent a cold chill down her spine. She wasn't just the daughter of a former president. She was a young black woman. And in the eyes of these officers, that seemed to be all that mattered. For a long moment, Malia couldn't speak. She was trapped in her thoughts, caught between the desire to assert her rights and the instinct to stay quiet, to avoid antagonizing the officers further. But then, something in her snapped, the realization that she could no longer remain silent, that this was not just about her, but about everyone who had ever been subjected to this kind of treatment, made her blood boil. "Why are you treating me like this?" Malia finally spoke, her voice shaking with both anger and disbelief. "What did I do wrong?" The officer with the buzz cut sneered. "Nothing. Just making sure you're not hiding anything. We've had reports of people on this road acting suspicious. Thought we'd check you out." Malia shook her head, the absurdity of his answer washing over her. The officers had no reason to stop her, no reason to question her. And yet, they had chosen to do so anyway. She wasn't just being judged for her actions or her behavior. She was being judged because of who she was. The weight of her father's legacy, the way her last name held so much power and significance, was now being used against her. As the officers continued to sift through her belongings, Malia felt a growing sense of helplessness. She knew she had to do something. She couldn't let this slide. She couldn't let herself be treated like this. No one should. This was more than just a personal violation. It was a reflection of the systemic injustice that still plagued the country. The way people like her were too often treated with suspicion, their every move scrutinized, their humanity questioned, her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been targeted by law enforcement, everyone who had been forced to prove their worthiness simply to exist. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. "Is there a problem here?" Malia asked, her voice more firm now, no longer the hesitant question of a young woman caught off guard. The officer paused, looking at her for a long moment. He seemed taken aback by the sudden change in her demeanor. Malia could see the shift in his expression. The moment when he realized she wasn't just going to accept his treatment without question. For a split second, he seemed almost uncomfortable, as if he hadn't expected her to fight back. Then, he dropped his gaze, muttering something under his breath, and nodded to his partner. "All right, you're free to go." Malia didn't move. She didn't trust them anymore. Not after everything that had just happened, but after what felt like an eternity. They finally backed away, signaling to her that she could return to her car. Without saying another word, Malia climbed back into the driver's seat, her body still trembling with the adrenaline of the encounter. Her thoughts were a blur, and her chest felt tight as she started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. As she drove away, she could feel the weight of the moment settling in. What had just happened wasn't just about her. It was a reflection of the larger system that continued to perpetuate injustice. It was a reminder of the constant scrutiny that Black individuals faced in this country, how their very existence was often viewed with suspicion and fear. But it was also a turning point. Malia knew this experience would stay with her, shape her, and fuel her desire to continue the fight for justice. No matter what, she would never let herself be silenced. Malia's story, though fictional, serves as a powerful reflection of a reality many people face daily. From police brutality to systemic discrimination, the struggles Malia experiences on the side of that road mirror the experiences of countless individuals who have been wrongfully targeted due to their race, social status, or identity. Across the world, stories like hers continue to unfold, stories that call for introspection and action. Take, for instance, the case of Sandra Bland, a 28-year-old African-American woman who was pulled over for a minor traffic violation in Texas in 2015. What began as a routine stop quickly escalated, with Bland being arrested for assaulting an officer, a charge many believe was unjust. 3 days later, she was found dead in her jail cell, an event that raised significant concerns about police brutality and the treatment of Black individuals in the U.S. justice system. Like Malia, Sandra was targeted not for any crime she had committed, but because of her identity. And, like Malia, her story left a lasting impact, shaking the nation and fueling ongoing protests against systemic injustice. While Bland's death was tragic, it also sparked important conversations about race, privilege, and power dynamics. The hashtag #SayHerName movement emerged, highlighting the stories of Black women who had been victims of police violence and brutality, stories that had long been overshadowed by the narratives of their male counterparts. The lessons drawn from her life and death are undeniable. It is crucial that we continue to challenge a system that dehumanizes and marginalizes Black individuals. But Sandra Bland's story isn't the only one that demonstrates the very real consequences of racial profiling. In 2014, Eric Garner, a father of 6, was choked to death by a police officer in Staten Island, New York. His crime? Allegedly selling loose cigarettes, an infraction that many argue should not have led to the deadly use of force. His final words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry for the Black Lives Matter movement, which aimed to raise awareness about police brutality and demand accountability from law enforcement. The case of Eric Garner, like Sandra Bland's, underscored the urgent need for reform within the justice system, particularly when it comes to racial profiling and the excessive use of force by police. What Malia and these real-life examples illustrate is the persistent and deeply ingrained nature of racial injustice. No matter how far society progresses, the core issues of inequality, bias, and prejudice remain. Yet, as painful as these stories are, they also offer lessons that we cannot ignore. First and foremost, it's clear that individuals, particularly those in positions of power, must be held accountable for their actions. The officers who stopped Malia, the ones who arrested Sandra Bland, and those who choked Eric Garner were all representatives of a system that must be reformed, holding law enforcement accountable for their behavior, ensuring transparency in the legal process, and fighting for stronger policies to protect marginalized communities are essential steps toward creating a more just society. But it's not just about accountability in the sense of punishing wrongdoers. It's about addressing the root causes of systemic racism and recognizing that real change requires structural reform, from biased policing practices to unequal educational opportunities. The issues are wide-reaching and deeply embedded in society. That's why Malia's story, though it may appear to be an isolated incident, is, in reality, part of a much larger and more complex narrative. It's a narrative that demands society question the way institutions operate and challenge the norms that perpetuate inequality. Another critical lesson from these real-world examples is the importance of speaking up. Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, and countless others may no longer be with us, but their legacies continue to inspire movements for change. Their stories became platforms for amplifying the voices of those who have been silenced for too long. They remind us that the fight for justice doesn't end with a single victory. It's an ongoing struggle that requires persistence, courage, and collective action. In the case of Malia, she did not stay silent. The moment she stood up to the officers and questioned their treatment, she was not only advocating for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that disproportionately targets certain communities. Her decision to speak out, despite the fear and uncertainty she faced, reminds us all of the power we hold when we refuse to be silenced in the face of injustice. This is a lesson that applies far beyond the context of law enforcement. In every facet of society, from education to healthcare to employment, individuals from marginalized communities continue to face discrimination and systemic barriers. The fight for racial justice is a fight for equality in all spheres of life, and every act of resistance, no matter how small, contributes to a larger movement for change. When people choose to speak up, to challenge the status quo, and to demand that their voices be heard, they are taking a stand not only for themselves but for their communities. Finally, the lessons we learn from these stories, whether they are from the tragic experiences of Sandra Bland and Eric Garner or the fictional encounter faced by Malia, are ultimately about empathy. The ability to step outside of ourselves and understand the pain and suffering of others is crucial for building a more just and compassionate world. It's about recognizing that racial injustice is not just an issue for those who are directly affected but for society as a whole. As long as one person is unjustly treated, all of us are complicit. Empathy leads to action, and action leads to change. The more people understand the reality of systemic racism, the more likely they are to take steps to fight it. This could mean protesting, advocating for policy reform, or even simply having difficult conversations with friends and family members about race and privilege. Every small action counts in the larger fight for justice. In Malia's moment of crisis, we see how critical it is for individuals, especially those in positions of privilege, to reflect on their own biases and actions. The officers who stopped her were not only perpetuating a system of racial injustice, but they were also part of the wider societal structure that enables such treatment. It's not enough to merely be aware of these issues. We must actively work to dismantle them. As we shift our focus from individual stories like that of Malia to the broader societal landscape, it becomes clear that the systemic issues we've discussed are not isolated incidents. Rather, they are deeply rooted in the fabric of society, shaping everything from education to employment, healthcare to housing. The racial injustices that Malia and countless others face are not just the result of individual prejudice. They are symptoms of a much larger and more pervasive problem. The systems and structures that perpetuate inequality must be examined, confronted, and ultimately reformed to create a society that offers true equity for all. One of the key factors contributing to these injustices is the normalization of inequality within our institutions. Whether it's the criminal justice system, educational institutions, or even the workplace, bias has been built into the systems that govern our lives. Historically marginalized groups, particularly Black and Indigenous communities, have been subjected to discriminatory practices that go beyond overt racism. These structural inequities create barriers that prevent these communities from accessing the same opportunities and resources as others, often leading to generational cycles of poverty, disenfranchisement, and marginalization. The educational system, for instance, has long been a site of racial inequity. Studies consistently show that schools in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods receive less funding than those in predominantly white areas. This disparity in resources leads to differences in the quality of education, which, in turn, affects the future opportunities of students in these communities. The fact that students of color are more likely to attend underfunded schools means they are less likely to receive the support and opportunities necessary to excel academically. This educational gap directly impacts the job prospects, income potential, and quality of life for these students as they grow older. Furthermore, the overrepresentation of students of color in special education programs and their underrepresentation in gifted and talented programs further perpetuate racial inequality. These disparities are not the result of any inherent differences in ability, but rather the outcome of biases that permeate educational decision-making. Teachers, administrators, and policymakers often unknowingly apply stereotypes when making decisions about students. leading to disproportionate outcomes based on race rather than merit. In turn, this reinforces the racial hierarchy that places white students at the top and students of color at the bottom, creating a cycle that is hard to break. The workplace is another arena where systemic inequality manifests. Racial discrimination in hiring practices, wage disparities, and limited access to career advancement opportunities continue to plague people of color. Despite legal protections, studies have shown that job applicants with traditionally black-sounding names are less likely to be called back for interviews than those with traditionally white-sounding names, even if their resumes are identical. Similarly, racial wage gaps persist, with people of color earning less than their white counterparts for the same work. These disparities are not just a matter of personal prejudice, but are embedded in the policies and practices of corporations, industries, and even entire economies. Even in healthcare, where access to quality medical care can be a matter of life or death, racial inequities are widespread. People of color are less likely to receive adequate healthcare, are more likely to suffer from preventable diseases, and are less likely to receive life-saving treatments. This is partly due to a lack of access to healthcare services in many predominantly Black and Latino communities. But it's also driven by racial biases within the medical profession itself. Studies have found that healthcare providers are often less likely to believe pain reports from patients of color, leading to delayed or inadequate treatment. This phenomenon, known as medical racism, contributes to poorer health outcomes for people of color, further exacerbating the inequities they face in other areas of life. What's clear from these examples is that racial inequality is not just a problem of individual prejudice or discriminatory actions. It is a deeply entrenched feature of our systems. The cumulative effect of these disparities is devastating, not only for the individuals directly affected, but for society as a whole. When large segments of the population are denied access to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities simply because of their race, society loses out on the full potential of its people. It's not just a moral issue, it's an economic one. We all suffer when talented individuals are held back by systemic discrimination. The solution to this problem, however, is not simply about addressing individual instances of racial bias or discrimination. While these efforts are important, they don't go far enough to address the root causes of inequality. True change requires structural reform, reworking the very systems that perpetuate inequality. This is why discussions around defunding the police and reimagining public safety have gained traction in recent years. The call is not to eliminate police departments entirely, but to redirect funds toward community-based programs that prioritize education, mental health services, and restorative justice over punitive measures. These reforms aim to break the cycle of criminalization that disproportionately affects communities of color and to invest in alternatives that foster healing and prevention rather than punishment. Similarly, reforms in education are essential. Equalizing funding across schools, diversifying curricula, and providing better resources for teachers are all steps that can be taken to ensure that students of color have the same opportunities as their white peers. Additionally, diversifying the teaching profession itself is critical, as students of color are more likely to succeed when they have educators who share their cultural background and experiences. These reforms, while challenging, are necessary to create a truly equitable educational system. In the workplace, anti-racism initiatives must go beyond token diversity efforts and address the systemic barriers that prevent people of color from advancing. This includes not only diversifying hiring practices, but also ensuring that employees of color have access to mentorship, leadership training, and opportunities for career development. Moreover, addressing the wage gap and ensuring that people of color are paid fairly for their work is an essential step toward economic justice. In healthcare, addressing medical racism and improving access to care for underserved communities are vital steps in reducing racial health disparities. This involves training healthcare professionals to recognize and confront their own biases, expanding access to healthcare in communities of color, and addressing the root causes of poor health, such as poverty, housing instability, and lack of access to nutritious food. Ultimately, the broader analysis of racial injustice reveals that while individual acts of racism are harmful, They are part of a larger, systemic issue that requires sweeping reform. The struggles of individuals like Malia are not isolated, but are reflective of a society that continues to grapple with deeply ingrained racial inequality. To address these issues, we must go beyond surface-level solutions and work toward fundamental change that dismantles the systems of oppression that have held marginalized communities back for centuries. As we conclude this journey through the complex landscape of systemic racial injustice, it's clear that change is not just necessary, it is urgent. The stories we've explored, from Malia's experiences in the educational system to the broader structural inequities within society, show us that racial injustice is not an abstract issue, but one that has real, tangible consequences for individuals and communities. The challenges are vast, and the road to reform is long, but the call to action is clear. We must take responsibility for confronting and dismantling these systems of oppression in our everyday lives and within our institutions. So, what can we do? First and foremost, we must begin by educating ourselves and others. Knowledge is power, and understanding the deep roots of racial inequality is a vital first step toward creating meaningful change. By learning about the history of racial injustice, we can better recognize its modern-day manifestations in education, the workplace, healthcare, and law enforcement. We must not shy away from uncomfortable conversations about race and racism, but rather lean into them with a spirit of openness, compassion, and a willingness to grow. This is not just an intellectual exercise, it's a necessary process to understand how we, as individuals and as a society, perpetuate inequality and how we can actively work to stop it. Education alone, however, is not enough. We must take action. One of the most effective ways to create change is through advocacy and activism. Whether it's advocating for policies that address racial disparities in education, pushing for criminal justice reform, or supporting initiatives that promote racial equity in healthcare, there are numerous ways we can make our voices heard. Contacting lawmakers, joining local organizations, and supporting grassroots movements are all essential parts of the fight for racial justice. Moreover, we can support businesses and institutions that are committed to promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in our everyday lives. We can make choices that reflect our commitment to dismantling racial inequalities, whether it's by supporting companies owned by people of color, donating to organizations that fight for racial justice, or amplifying the voices of marginalized communities. Every decision we make, whether in our purchasing power, the media we consume, or the policies we support, sends a message about what we stand for. Another powerful way to create change is by addressing racial inequality within our own spheres of influence. As educators, we can ensure that our classrooms are places where all students feel valued and supported, regardless of their racial background. We can actively work to diversify curricula, challenge stereotypes, and provide opportunities for students of all races to see themselves reflected in the materials they study. As employers, we can implement anti-racism training, create inclusive hiring practices, and foster a workplace environment where everyone feels heard and respected. And as community members, we can actively work to break down barriers of segregation and division, whether it's by participating in local outreach programs, supporting initiatives that promote intercommunity dialogue, or standing up against racism whenever and wherever we encounter it. Importantly, we must also listen to and center the voices of those who are most affected by racial injustice. People of color, particularly Black and Indigenous communities, have long been at the forefront of the fight for racial justice. It is crucial that we follow their lead, amplify their voices, and support their efforts. This means being willing to put aside our own perspectives and privileges in order to make space for others to share their experiences and struggles. It's through this solidarity and collective action that we can create a movement powerful enough to bring about meaningful change. But change is not just about advocating for policy reforms or supporting movements. It's also about personal transformation. Each of us has a role to play in examining our own biases, prejudices, and privileges. It can be difficult and uncomfortable to confront our own involvement in perpetuating systems of oppression, but it is a necessary step toward creating a more just and equitable world. By committing to personal growth and self-reflection, we contribute to the larger effort of dismantling the systems of inequality that harm us all. While the task ahead may seem daunting, history has shown that progress is possible when individuals, communities, and institutions come together with a shared commitment to justice. From the civil rights movement to the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests, we have seen the power of collective action in effecting change. We have witnessed the ways in which communities can come together to challenge injustice, demand accountability, and fight for a future where all people, regardless of race, have the opportunity to thrive. And yet, as we look to the future, we cannot forget that the fight for racial justice is ongoing. In many ways, the work has only just begun. We live in a world where racial inequities continue to persist, where police violence, educational disparities, and health inequalities continue to disproportionately affect communities of color. But we also live in a world where people are rising up, speaking out, and demanding change. The movement for racial justice is not a passing trend. It is a movement that will continue to grow, evolve, and push for transformative change until racial inequality is a thing of the past. The conclusion, then, is clear. Racial justice is not a matter of charity, nor is it simply a moral issue. It is a matter of human rights. The systems that perpetuate racial inequality must be dismantled, and in their place, we must build a world that is truly just and equitable. This is a world where people of all races are given the same opportunities, the same access to resources, and the same respect. This is a world where racial prejudice and bias no longer have a place in our institutions, our workplaces, or our communities. But building this world requires all of us. It requires a collective commitment to learning, advocating, and acting. It requires a willingness to confront difficult truths and to change the systems that continue to harm marginalized communities. And it requires us to come together, to stand in solidarity with those who have been oppressed for too long, and to work alongside them as allies in the fight for justice. We cannot afford to sit idly by while racial inequality continues to cause harm. The time to act is now. We each have a role to play in the movement for racial justice, and together, we can create the change we so desperately need. Let us move forward with hope, determination, and a commitment to a future where racial justice is a reality for all.